Stories that matter. The journey of life from birth to death is an extraordinary trip, sometimes filled with great joy and excitement, but at other times filled with pain, sorrow, and disappointment. Stories That Matter shares both extremes with you. Sometimes our stories will make you feel very happy, but the journey of life is not all happiness. Other times, the journey of life will make you feel sad, for all of us have experienced both extremes. Stories That Matter will begin right after the break with a story that will touch your heart in the journey of life.
Welcome to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Pam Johnson. And Pam, thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be here.
You know, most people will not know what we're doing with this show today, but this is a really unique show. Your dad was Robert Rafferty.
Yes.
And Robert, although that name may not be familiar to most people, he was the cook on the ship, the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Correct.
And the Edmund Fitzgerald sank on November 10th of 1975. Would that be correct?
40 years ago.
Yeah, 40 years ago. And you were a very young woman. What is your, tell me about your family. Were your mom and dad married that time?
My mom and dad were married. My mom passed away 11 years after my dad's boat sank. I have a half-brother. We have the same mother. We have different fathers. My father did raise my brother Randall as his own, and we were just a family of four. We ate really good with my dad cooking on the ship.
Yeah, how did he get into that, becoming a cook?
I'm not really sure. I kind of looked upon it one time. I found his, may I show you?
Yeah, sure. It's yours.
My dad's, this is his union card, and I always say to people when I show this that my father looked a little bit like an alien. Now, the reason I say that is because my father was born without hair. He had a disease called alopecia, and so he has no hair anywhere, ever. I, being a daughter, had hair, and so it stopped with me. My grandchildren and my
your kids and grandchildren haven't had that problem?
No.
How many kids you have?
I have 4 kids. I have a daughter and 3 sons.
How many grandkids now?
15 grandchildren and almost 6 great-grandchildren.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah, he'd like that.
How cool. Well, had you already left home by the time this incident happened, or were you still living at the family home?
I had moved down to Fort Benning, Georgia. We left in March of 1974. We stayed there, then we moved into quarters on post there, and we'd been there a little while, and my dad came down to visit me in March. And
March of 74?
75. He
75,
came down.
so a few months before.
Right, and when he came down and drove away, I said, "I'll never see him again." And I quoted that in one of these books I have here, and the author took that and used it as a means the beginning of a new chapter in this book. I just had that feeling that I would never see him again.
Really? What caused you to have that feeling?
Just a real sadness when he left, like a gloom had come over me. And I had just barely been pregnant when he showed up. And 9 months later, my son Jeremiah was born, and he was born 36 days after the sinking of the ship.
Did you and your father have a good relationship?
Oh, yeah.
And so you had a good time when he came down for that event, but you just had a premonition that
just a feeling
something was going to,
right.
Well, I wouldn't see him again. Did you ever tell him that?
No, I never said that.
Okay.
And I still have, my dad took me shopping to, like at Kmart, and he bought me an electric mixer, and I still use that to this day.
How did he, with the cooking, tell me about, you know, when the family was growing up, was he the one that primarily did the cooking, or did your mom, or both of them?
He did it a lot in January and December and February, and he would make big, huge pots of spaghetti sauce, stews, soups, and when we moved from one house, he had this theory that when you test the spaghetti, you throw it up against the wall. If it sticks, it's done. When we moved out from that house, there was 10 pounds of spaghetti behind the stove. So that he used that theory.
Did he always have a good sense of humor?
He was a very jolly man, very happy. Would always trick me doing things, you know, little playthings. He'd set me on the floor and said that he could mop up the floor without ever touching a mop or a towel, and so he poured the water between my legs by my knees, and then he pulled me
Pulled
through
you
it.
all around.
See, you know that trick.
Well, no, but I can imagine. And now that I'm a dad and a granddad, well, I thought probably
course.
crossed my mind a few times, but
He
the others
was-
wouldn't like it. So
Yeah, and he loved to eat out. Anytime we went anywhere, we'd go to a restaurant, and he would visit his sisters in Toledo, and I had a very good childhood.
well, it sounds like it.
Yeah.
Was he at the time that you were still living at the home? The first recollection that you have, was he a cook on boats at that time?
Yes.
So as long as you can remember, he's always been out to sea or out on the lakes.
Right. This union card, it says 1959. I would have been 7, so that's really all I've ever
Yeah.
known. I would go up the ladders many times on many ships in Toledo, Ohio. And then when my children were born, he would carry them up, and I was always afraid that he would fall or drop them, because he fell between the dock and the boat one time and broke his leg.
I want to talk about that when we come back.
Okay.
Time for us to take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Pam Johnson. If you haven't been with us at the start of this show, shame on you, because you missed an awfully good start. Pam's father was Robert Rafferty, and Robert was the cook on the Edmund Fitzgerald. That was the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, of course, was made infamous or famous, whichever way you want to look at it, by Gordon Lightfoot. And you were kind enough to bring over one of Gordon's the old albums and that he had signed to you. You met him 4, 5, 6 times?
Yeah.
And the most recently, he was at Salina at the Staple Theater, and you were over there. He recognized you, of course, because you knew him from probably 1975 or 6, somewhere along in there.
Yes, 76.
Yeah, and he is the one who actually wrote the song.
Correct.
Lived up in that area and saw, as I recall, he said that he had read it in the paper. It touched his heart, and he put it to words. And then he refined it a little bit and ultimately recorded it. And to this day, it is a very, very well-known song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Yes.
And your dad was the cook on it.
When he wrote the song, he'd wondered why in the Mariners Church the bell had rang for 29 times. And that made him curious. So he called down and they said, well, you know, there was a ship that sank. And of course, he'd heard about it on his radio in Toronto, Canada. And so he tried to find a little bit more out. Why was the bell rang? Why did it ring 29 times? And then he realized, oh, there's 29 men on the ship. So he got a hold of them and started talking to the Reverend Ingalls. And Reverend Ingalls said, yes, it sank last night at about 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. And it had become, this was Tuesday now, when they kind of got together trying to figure out what was going on. And also Gordon Lightfoot wrote the song because he felt there was a little bit of disrespect that they had misspelled the word Edmund. They made it with an O instead of the U. So he wanted to correct that, make that correct and right.
Actually, am I right about this one here, that the Edmund Fitzgerald was named, it was actually owned by an insurance company. Was that Northwestern?
Yes.
And owned it, and the president of the board or CEO of the board, his name was Edmund Fitzgerald.
Correct.
And was it Mrs. Fitzgerald who christened the boat?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
there was problems from the very beginning with that, wasn't there?
Yes, it was almost as if it was haunted. They couldn't break the wine bottle. They finally got that done, and when they went to put the boat into the water, it kind of took a list to the side, which made the water come up, and it splashed on all the people. They weren't expecting that, and one man actually died of a heart attack.
My goodness.
Yeah.
And the ship had the name, of course, the Edmund Fitzgerald. It was a 729-foot boat. We called it ship and boat. We've used that term interchangeably. But your dad would have referred to it as a boat?
Boat,
Okay.
yes.
All right. Okay, so a 729-foot boat, the biggest they were allowed to have hauling freight at that time in those locations was 730. Correct?
Right.
So this was one of the biggest boats, probably the biggest boat for a long, long time.
Correct.
And this boat was built in 1958. Would that be correct? And it was in continual service from then. And I had read that that ship would make, or that boat would make 47 trips, take 5 days to go from point A to deliver the freight at point B, and it would take 5 days of time. So your dad was gone a lot on that lake, wasn't he?
Yes. He did that most of my life. There were some summers that he would go for a 3-month tour, and he would go to different countries. He's been to Vietnam twice, China. He went to he went to Japan to get my mom China. I get that mixed up. I still have her China. And while he went to Vietnam 2 times, he met my brother, who was in the Air Force, and they got to spend time together, which is not heard of back in the late 60s.
No, I imagine. Was your brother in Vietnam at the time?
Yes, he was in the Air Force.
And your dad, was he private? Was he a commercial cook on a ship when he met him in Vietnam, or was he in the service too?
No, he was on the boat. I don't know which one it would be.
And this the one we referred to earlier, the National Maritime Union of America, that's your dad's union book.
Yeah.
You also brought in with you today, and this is what I think is probably really is a treasure. What is this?
This is a cookbook that my brother and I found after my mom had passed away. We had decided we would divide things up. And he had his own father and has some of his stuff. And so we started going through some of the things that belonged to my father, and we found that. And I of all the things I own, that's probably priceless to me. In the very beginning, like the first or second page, it says, and this was dated January 15th, 1942.
Wow.
And it says at the beginning that since the sailors are getting sick, now you must refrigerate the food and not leave it on the counter all night.
So it had bits of wisdom that were in there. And was this your dad's cookbook? Did he have?
Yes.
What did he have on the ship with him, or the boat?
You know, at this time I don't know, but he was a temporary cook there towards the end before his retirement. So he would just take a job here and job there, and he actually said, "I do not want to be on here. Please get me off." And
He didn't want to be on the Edmund Fitzgerald?
No,
why not?
He said it was haunted. There were several, a tape that I will leave with you so that you can, you'll find some rare footage of another cook that was on there for 10 years saying he had gone down to the bottom of the boat and he could look through and see light. He says, "I'm not going on there." He says, "I spent 10 years on it. I'm going to take leave." And Rafferty's on there. Let him do it. But because Rafferty was on there, he was on there actually because another man, Richard Bishop, had bleeding ulcers. He tried to get back, but when he picked up his suitcases, he started to bleed again. And they said, "Rafferty's on there, let him finish it out."
So your dad wasn't even scheduled to be on the Edmund Fitzgerald?
Correct.
I think I remember you and I were talking about this. Was this probably going to be his last run?
Yes.
As a cook on any of the lakes, or on the Edmund Fitzgerald, or both?
Both. He was retiring from, he was 62, retiring, as well as the captain that day. They were supposed to get off and never to return. That was going to be their last service to the merchant marines. That
boat had another captain that took a lot of the trips. Did you ever get to meet him?
That would probably been Captain McSorley. There was one before him. It was Pulser.
Pulser.
Yeah, and he was a gentler, more, he would go slow.
A little less daring.
And McSorley, "Get her done."
Get her done, get her moving. Well, speaking of get her moving, we're going to cut away to a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue to talk about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald and your father.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Pam Johnson. And we've been talking about your father, Robert, who was the cook on the Edmund Fitzgerald, and that event, of course, was made well known by Gordon Lightfoot when he did the song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. You had told me earlier as we were talking that you were at Fort Benning, Georgia. You and your husband were stationed there, and when the wreck happened. Sometime that day or night, you got a call. Who was it from? What was it?
Actually, I didn't get the call until the next day on Tuesday. I think my mom and my stepbrother wanted to make sure that what they had heard on the news, not through Ogle Bay Norton, not through Northwestern, we're still waiting for that phone call. We never received a call from the company. My mom just happened to see it on TV.
Really? Nobody called her to say what had happened to her husband, or
No,
she just saw it on television?
a lot of family members did that. I really felt they treated our family bad.
Well, that was a pretty tough deal. In my own case with my father, same thing happened. We saw it on evening news, and that was 53. And that was a pretty tough deal when you're a little kid, or when you're an older person at the time.
An old lady who's
now,
pregnant.
You weren't an old lady, but you told me you were having you were pregnant with your fourth child. Okay, and so does your mom call you on the day after? It would be the 11th.
She calls me the day after. I'm not home. I've spent almost 47 days with my husband on leave and 3 little kids, and I'm pregnant. I got to get out of here. So I go next door to a friend's, and we sat down just talking, and my husband, Bill, come over and knocked on the door. I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm just talking to Gloria." He said, "Well, you need to come home." "Well, why do I need to come home?" I told him I'm just sick of being over there.
I need a break from being mom.
I need a break. And he said, "No, you need to come home." And the tone in his voice just made me feel like there was something
wrong.
Something going on. So I come home, and the first thing I do is I pick up the newspaper. Well, we're going to go see a movie. And then it hit me right there on the front page, or a page.
This is the local paper where you were in Georgia?
Newspaper.
This one?
This
This
one.
is how you found out?
That's how I found out.
It says ship sinks in storm 29 aboard.
Correct.
And so it was in the local paper.
Right. But we did not get any official word from anyone, just that my mom had called and told my husband that I need to come home. She needs to talk to me. I call home. Well, first I see that. Then I call home, and I never referred to my father this way, but I said, "Is my daddy dead?" I guess that was the 5-year-old coming out in me.
Sure.
And she said, "Well, they're not really sure. They haven't really found anything yet, but they assume that it has sank, and they have found like a life preserver and maybe a long oar and part of a rowboat, but that was all they'd found." And I found out about 5 o'clock the next day, which is just about 24 hours that they had, finally figured out that it had gone. Someone just told me this the other day that they had called the Coast Guard. The ship behind, which was called the Arthur M. Anderson,
Yes.
which still sails today, says, "I think we have a ship out there that's missing." And they said, "Well, while you're out and about, do you think you can get this little skipper that's got 12 people on it?" And they were saying, "There's an iron ore carrier missing." And I guess the Coast Guard just didn't get it right. But they sent for people from the Sault Ste. Marie, and that took 6 hours to get through those locks. So by the time they got through that and then started on their way into Lake Superior, they were way far behind.
Yeah.
And Arthur Anderson kept calling back and calling back. And finally they declared that, yes, we need to start looking. And so they asked the Arthur M. Anderson, "Would you be willing to go back?" And Captain Cooper said, "Oh, I don't know. I don't think I could do that." So he went downstairs and he prayed and asked for guidance. And he come back up and he asked the crew, "Are you willing?" And they said yes.
Because they were in the same storm.
They were in the same storm,
Yeah.
just a little bit ahead or a little bit behind.
Well, bless their hearts that they went back and tried to find the ship, but of course it was already sank
gone.
by then. Now you mentioned that it was a cargo boat or ship
Yes.
at the time. Is this what your dad's
Yeah.
your dad's boat would have been hauling?
This is called iron ore. It's very dirty. And it's
Well, I wish I hadn't told you to pull
oh,
that
it's
out
okay.
now.
It's okay. I'm used to it. And each one of these are relatively small, but when you have 26,000 tons of this, that made the ship go way down low, which probably helped in the sinking.
I would
Yeah.
think so. Yeah. Likewise, the ship, the Edmund Fitzgerald, had a nickname. They called it. It was a reference to but also to the Titanic too, didn't they?
I've heard of that before, but I'm not real familiar
Not sure
with that.
you haven't familiar with that. This is what they called it, the Mighty Fritz.
The Mighty Fitz.
Fitz.
And
And that's the Edmund Fitzgerald
that's
on
it right there.
Okay. Did you ever see the boat or ship?
Yeah.
Did you get to be on it at all?
I can't remember.
Can't remember.
I wished, I was 17, we got married, had all those babies, and then we left in 74. I don't really remember what my childhood was like. I just know it was really good. And I got to go on the ships and boats all the time to see my dad's cooking, going to the galley. And I've had a lot of weird, scary stuff happen to me since all this has gone down, literally. a family member called me and said, would you remember if your dad was in Philadelphia and that he went into a bar and he asked somebody would they give him a ride back to the docks, and if they brought him back he would let him come into the gallery and he'd give him a tour and give him some cookies and coffee and stuff. And so they did. When they climb up the ladder, they get inside. These two people got real scared, and one said, I got to get out of here. He put his head down on the table and said, can't do it, got to get out of here. This is too haunted. And the other person was like, well, what are you getting at? My dad was supposedly embarrassed. See, I don't know any of this. This is just what's been told to me. They go home, and 6 weeks later, the ship sank. See, I told you it was haunted.
Did your dad have that feeling about the ship?
Oh, yeah. He did not want to be on there. He wanted to get off. He tried several times, and the cook that had been on there 10 years, he says, I'm taking vacation. And you'll hear him say this in this tape.
I'll listen to that. When you read this about in your local newspaper about your dad being on the ship, of course, that sank, did your thoughts go back to the last time you saw him and where you had that premonition that that may be the last time?
I did. I felt that come right back to me. I'm not a psychic person or anything, but I just had a gut feeling this is going to be the last time I see my dad. And as he drove away in that old rickety car, I felt so sorry for him because he was in a position down in Georgia. He didn't know anybody, and he was going along on this crazy ship.
I understand. We got to cut away, take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Pam Johnson. Her father, Robert, the cook on the Edmund Fitzgerald. We're looking right now. This is a picture of your father, and I don't see a date on it, but do you have a recollection of when that was taken?
That would have been about 1960.
1960, okay. And what, you know, you've been to lots of reunions, and there's lots of people who have lost their life in the Great Lakes and Lake Superior because it's a very risky business.
Yes.
And your dad was on his last journey, and then he was going to retire, and he didn't really want to be on the Edmund Fitzgerald. He had that feeling that the ship was, there was something wrong, whether it's a haunted term or otherwise, but he felt something was wrong with that. What was your understanding of what caused the boat to sink?
I believe truly it was, of course, an act of God. It was God's time to take those 29 men. I do believe because it was carried heavily iron ore pellets that as the wave hit it, it kind of went this way, and then all the pellets fell down and actually made the ship twist. Now the part where my father's at is upside down. So he would be in this part, but it would be upside down.
Wow.
A little bit of a pocket of air. I always wondered, did he write me a letter?
Time may tell. We'll
Time
see.
may tell.
Thank you so much for being here, Pam. Thank you for watching the show. Thanks.